Hello, everybody. This is Tatiana Moroz, and welcome to the Tatiana Moroz Show. I'm here with my friends Chris DeRose and John Light. They're both into Bitcoin, and we're very happy to be here on Liberty.me. We're going to be broadcasting this podcast version of this onto LTV2, so welcome to that audience. Very happy to be here. Chris, John, a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine.
Thank you for having
us.
So why don't you guys tell everybody at home a little bit about what your, I guess, participation is in the space. Where do you fit?
John, do I go first?
Oh, I'll let you go first.
All right, so I've done a lot in this space. For those who haven't seen me, I've done writing for, many of the magazines, many of the online magazines and journals. Most recently, I've been writing for American Banker. And prior to that, I was contributing a little bit to Let's Talk Bitcoin. And what my real gig is in this space is in the Counterparty project. I'm the community director. So for those that don't know, Counterparty is a project that works atop of Bitcoin and provides a lot of 2.0 services, things like smart contracts and assets. And that's most of what I do. All right, John, your turn.
And black hats with white words. That's another thing you do.
Yes, it is. It most certainly is.
So I also do a little bit of work with Let's Talk Bitcoin Network. I have a podcast called P2P Connects Us, which is syndicated on Let's Talk Bitcoin Network, and it's also released through my website and blog, p2pconnects.us. It's all about peer-to-peer philosophy, technology, and culture, and how I think that's changing the world for the better, and also covering some of the current events that are happening, like government intervention in these new peer-to-peer markets, some of the technological advances, some of the social and cultural disruption that's happening as a result of the adoption of these kinds of technologies. And so it's just really fascinating to watch that. And in my professional life, that's something the podcast is something I do kind of as a hobby. In my professional life, I do consulting and advising for digital currency startups.
Very cool. So I brought us all together today because I had some interesting conversations with John that I followed up with Chris. But before we get to that, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about a totally personal, self-serving question that I've just randomly been wondering about. What's going on with Counterparty? What are they working on right now, Chris?
A lot of stuff. I'm not privy to discuss everything, but Symbiont certainly is chugging ahead. I think they've got some pretty big announcements. Symbiont is, I guess, the phoenix that rose from the ashes of the Overstock deal, the Medici deal. The principals that were involved in Medici had left the Medici project and started Symbiont. So Symbiont has a subset of the features that were in the Medici project and some additional features that weren't. So I think a lot of people in the community were very discouraged when the Overstock thing kind of unraveled. But certainly for me, I've seen a lot of work being done with Symbiont. And I personally expect that a lot of the perceived losses will be quickly gained as they see that project gain momentum. But it's still a little too soon to tell. There's a lot of work that they're doing in their end. In the community, we've got all kinds of stuff. We have our first mobile wallet was pretty exciting. We have a integrated Chrome wallet, which is also very exciting. And there's a game that is going to be I think the first cryptocurrency 2.0 game that's launching on the Counterparty network, and that's really cool too. That's something we could probably talk about at length, but I'll keep that answer as is.
Okay, well, wait, what's the Symbiont project? Because I don't really understand what that is completely, and some people at home may not know what that is.
Right, well, it's kind of by design at the moment, unfortunately. It is, what I can tell you, and really the extent of even what I know, is that it is a project to facilitate more traditional integrations with Wall Street, to facilitate security and, I believe, bond transfers, and to facilitate better settlement of these types of assets using Bitcoin and using Counterparty.
Okay.
It's a little bit similar to what perhaps you heard today with NASDAQ. So they're doing something very similar, and I think this is a new wave of applications that we'll see in the next year. All the big players are doing.
Okay, so is that a good thing? I don't know. I mean, is that something that's going to... I guess maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit, but if we're going to be talking about the soul of Bitcoin, when I think of Bitcoin, I think of it as the great liberator for the people. And the concept of decentralized apps and just that type of thing is really something that I think mankind has been searching for unsuccessfully until now, since the beginning of time. So is that going to be something geared toward the banking industry? Who would be benefiting from that type of technology?
Yeah, so I mean that definitely gets into the heart of I think the episode that we're going for. I personally don't have a problem with the banks, but I know the libertarian platform does. So at some level, we have to decide, is Bitcoin a social movement? Is it technology? Is it a tool? Is it all of the above? Is it none of the above? In terms of what it's good for, is it good for a subset of these things? It's a technology, and it can be used for good purposes and bad. I like a lot of the services that Wall Street does. That must be a minority of the Bitcoin movement, but for me, I find that there's a lot of value in those services, which we can get into at length if you like, but that may not be the answer you want to hear. I don't know.
I don't think that don't feel any pressure from me to answer in any way. This is the point of a discussion. John, did you want to comment on that in any way?
So I think that these moves by the traditional financial services companies to get involved with Bitcoin is predictable. I mean, it's a new technology that's getting a lot of attention, and it also happens to add a lot of efficiency to some of their operations. So it's not surprising that they're looking at blockchain technology. Some of them are looking at building directly on the Bitcoin protocol. And I think the news about NASDAQ was not about them putting a production system on the Bitcoin protocol, but rather they're just using the colored coins protocol on top of Bitcoin open assets for a trial run to see how their assets interact with blockchain technology. And it remains to be seen whether they're actually going to continue using the Bitcoin blockchain or whether they're going to try to roll their own blockchain and use a kind of centrally administered kind of blockchain, like what some of the other experiments, like the Isle of Man, the recent Isle of Man blockchain integration was discussing. They were talking about using a centrally administered blockchain kind of system. And so, are these things positive, negative? I mean, it's kind of a continuation of the status quo, just powered by blockchain. Does it provide benefits to all of the people using those kinds of systems? Well, I mean, we hope. I mean, that's why they're trying it out. They're seeing if it reduces costs, increases efficiencies, and ultimately ends up being a better system for everybody who's using those systems. Now, does it change the fundamental nature of those systems? Not really. And so if you're not really a fan of the fundamental nature of those systems, then this news probably doesn't really mean much to you.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I don't think that there's a problem with banking services separate from, for example, the Federal Reserve. I mean, I like having a bank, I guess. I don't even know if I do. I don't know if that's a true statement. But arguably, a bank does fulfill some sort of purpose. I think that the issue that people have is more the central banking system and banks ripping people off constantly. I do think that there's obviously costs associated with sending money from place to place, or if there's some sort of, if you're like a small person and you only have a couple $100 in the bank isn't making money off of you. So when you overdraft your account, as much as one may dislike that, there is at least some sort of sense in terms of, okay, the bank needs to make money. I think the problem is that the bank is making money off of the little guy in a way that is very painful to a person that doesn't have a lot of money. Because if you're poor and you overdraft your bank account, then that $35 or whatever can be turning into, $150 very quickly, and things get out of control. As a random side note, what I find really frustrating with banking, no matter what bank that I use, is whenever it's in their favor to charge me immediately on my card, they're happy to do it. When it's a matter of me putting money in or needing an extra day or something like that, I'll notice that sometimes transactions don't hit for a few days, even though other ones do, and then all of a sudden, without knowing it, I can be overdrawn. And I think that that's really frustrating, because it's like an email goes by instantly. Certain transactions happen instantly, but the ones that are important, like the ones that are going to cause you to overdraft, that's something that doesn't happen instantly. And then on top of that, which I guess the bankers would probably think that this is okay, but when you call the bank and you explain it to them, they generally don't care, and they say, tough luck, you have to pay it, and that's the general attitude. So I think that breeds a lot of animosity with people. Nice cat.
Oh. Yeah.
You're muted, Chris. John, while Chris tries to figure that out, do you have anything that you wanted? Oh, here's Chris. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was trying to fix that echo issue we had earlier. Yeah, so, I would add to some of your complaints that would suggest are a little misplaced. I understand why people don't like banks, but it seems to me like more often than not the banks are spokesperson or the intermediaries between government rulings and government regulations and people. Like, banks don't necessarily want to make you their enemy. If you have money to be made off of, they will make that money off of you and smile and make it a wonderful experience. But I think a lot of what we see as anti-consumer have to do with onerous regulations in the space. And I actually think that that's one of the things that Bitcoin can really help with, is it provides these options that circumvent a lot of those regulations and allow banks to perhaps better reflect the free market sort of interfaces that they would have with consumers. And I see that a lot with like the libertarians even. Like, I think that they think that the banks are in this sort of like conspiracy to shaft everybody, but I don't necessarily see it that way personally. I think it really has more to do with...
Did you hear about Jekyll Island? Come on now. The banks are not in a conspiracy when they wear costumes and they pretend to be somebody else and they put through a bill to put in a central banking system on Christmas. There's no conspiracy there?
That's politics at some level, and I did hear some of that. Another thing you have with the libertarian platform typically is like a sort of bent towards like the Fed being this black box and being like a conspiracy engine. I get some of that. I think a lot of that has to do with the nature of, again, being involved in politics. I'm not necessarily the most qualified person, admittedly, to talk about finance, but for a long time the banks were not necessarily in cahoots with the government, and it wasn't until we had advances brought about by central banking that really started to change to the degree we see today. But everyone's got an opinion on that, certainly. Mine's not necessarily popular in the libertarian community.
Do you remember, John, we're going to jump to you in a second, but do you remember the thing where General Smedley Butler, the most decorated, war guy, what do you call him?
He was a Marine.
Marine, fine. In history, who wrote an amazing piece, it escapes me. John.
War is a racket.
There you go, the war is a racket. And wasn't he hired by the banks to basically march on Washington? Or they tried to hire him anyway? Okay.
There's a lot of you can't I don't think you can make a general sweeping statement and say all banks think this or all banks do that. Banks are ultimately, they're made up of people, and in any other kind of large bureaucratic organization, you're going to have some people that have some ideas, and you're going to have other people that have other ideas, and then things percolate from the top down and from the bottom up, and then decisions are made within certain areas of a bank that might not reflect the ideals of another area of that same bank because it's just a huge bureaucratic institution. But do we see a lot of banks that lobby for regulations that lead to them gaining more power? Yes. Do we see a lot of favoritism being played by the government, picking winners and losers in the banking industry, bailing some banks out, letting other banks fail? Yes. Do we see bankers in kind of very interchangeable revolving door roles? One day they're an executive at a bank, the next day they're a regulator in the government. Yes. So, but that's something that you see in a lot of different industries. You know, the government, when they look for people to regulate an industry, they look for experts. And oftentimes those experts come from industry. And so sometimes it's hard to avoid conflicts of interest. Sometimes it's hard to avoid these dual overlapping kinds of roles that are played. And it's not unique to the banking industry. It's just that banking is something that affects so many people at a very personal level, because money is basically just a representation of our life force energy. It's very fundamental to our existence, and it's very fundamental to our social relations with the people around us. And so, because banks have a lot of control in that area, when banks make decisions that affect their customers, or governments make decisions that affect banks and then affect their customers, those things they have ripple effects across the whole economy, and they affect people's lives at a very personal level. And so it's very understandable that people would have strong opinions about what banks do and how those decisions affect people's lives. I think what's one of the great things about Bitcoin is that it takes the central control over money, that fundamental life force energy that we use to relate to other people, and it takes that away, that power away from central entities, and places it into the hands of the market, essentially, to choose whether we want a currency and a monetary system that is centrally controlled, or we want one that is controlled by a decentralized network of kind of market incentivized actors. And we're seeing that debate play out over time, and time will tell whether that's something that people want either permanently all the time, or whether that's something that people want only in certain contexts, and they're willing to deal with banks and central banks in other contexts, or whether it's something that's rejected outright by all but a few niche players in the market. And I'm kind of rooting for Bitcoin. I would like to see Bitcoin and cryptocurrency systems kind of take over, as it were. But there's going to continue to be a role for these central institutions for quite a while, I think.
I think that it's really hard to say that that we have a choice and it's up to the people as to what happens, because there are limitations placed on people, mostly financial, and also with lobbying for certain licenses. For example, one of the criticisms I heard about the license, one of the many things, is that it is basically protecting the big guy, and then the little guy's voice isn't getting heard. So I don't think it's fair to say that the market has spoken, because there are so many other things influencing that decision for people. Even something as simple as marketing. If you don't have the right marketing, look at Bitcoin right now. I'm always, and I know a lot of people that are trying to do stuff to show the best parts of Bitcoin, to show what makes Bitcoin so cool and how Bitcoin can change the world and all these wonderful applications for it. But there's not a financial incentive, not a direct financial incentive to support that. So that voice
I think that's I don't know if that's true. I mean, like, Bitcoin investors, people who hold Bitcoin and expect it to appreciate in the future, have an incentive to increase adoption. worldwide. And whether that's within a particular market, a market that they're familiar with, or whether that's taking the message, the value proposition, if you will, of Bitcoin to whole new markets. You said something interesting, and I think it relates to what Chris was talking about earlier with Overstock's decision to kind of not use counterparty and kind of go with their own centralized system. I think that decision was made for regulatory reasons, not just technological reasons. And Bitcoin will have kind of limited effects, and I think limited ability to really change the system in places where there's a lot of government control over how money is used. But I think there's a lot of potential for Bitcoin to have a positive effect and to be used for really incredible, in really incredible kind of ways, similar to kind of Patrick Byrne's vision of what he wanted the colored coin stock system to look like, to be used by people in developing parts of the world where maybe financial regulations aren't really that oppressive, just because they're not that far along in their development yet, if you want to call that a feature of development, where people can use the Bitcoin itself as a store of value, as a means of exchange, but they could also use the Bitcoin blockchain to track property ownership in places where like property titles, land registries, and things like that. Those kinds of systems either don't exist, or if they do exist, they're a complete mess. They could use the Bitcoin blockchain to issue securities and basically fundraise for their small businesses, and have people from all over their country, all over the world, invest in their small business and receive dividends directly on the blockchain. Completely cutting out central like middlemen who typically are in control of like stock issuance and stock trading and stuff. You could do peer-to-peer lending directly on the blockchain. I mean, when you remove some of these financial regulations that kind of hold Bitcoin back from its true potential, like here in the United States and parts of Europe, so much more becomes possible, and the ability for people to use Bitcoin to empower themselves and really lift themselves up out of a tough situation that they're currently in, just because the financial infrastructure isn't there to be able to. I think that's something that that's an area that Bitcoin entrepreneurs and Bitcoin investors should really be looking at if they want to kind of increase the use of the blockchain. The first world is an interesting place for Bitcoin as like a replacement for PayPal or something like that, but it's not a replacement for the New York Stock Exchange. It's not a replacement for even potentially like international settlement infrastructure. It's something that is really meant to be used by the people peer-to-peer, and unfortunately in the U.S. the regulations just don't really allow for that very much.
I want to add into this for a little bit. To back it up a little bit, we've had decentralized currencies in the past, and certainly I think all origins of currencies would now be considered decentralized, and that there was no central control. We had things like beaver pelts, maybe, or we certainly had seashells, and then of course even today we have gold. So a lot of these decentralized currencies have existed, and my point would be that I don't think people actually want them on average. Now, certainly Bitcoin is a major innovation. It is certainly an electronic decentralized currency, which we've never had. But I think the fact remains is that at the macroeconomic level, all of our economies in this world compete, and they compete in much the same way that the free market economy competes. And so when you have a centrally controlled currency that can leverage wealth, these economies typically have more money to spend. They are wealthier societies whose members are themselves wealthier because of it. And I think that as much as I love Bitcoin, I don't necessarily see it displacing a lot of centralized currencies for reasons like that. There's others, and I would probably go so far as to say that private currencies may be a better efficiency than public and federally managed currencies. But I don't actually think that people want that. And towards the allegation that we don't have a choice, well, I think things like PorcFest show otherwise. We do have choice. You can pay for your omelet in gold or something like that, or silver, or what have you, not just in Bitcoin. And there's a small segment of the economy, and there's an entire state that perhaps may one day do this, but I think that it's a small percentage of the population, because even though they wouldn't necessarily tell you that what they want is a leveraged currency, they want all the benefits that go with that, which is typically a higher standard of living and so on and so forth. So as much as I think Bitcoin is going to change things, I don't know that it's going to change things in some of those senses, and I think that's all I have to say about that.
When you say leveraged currency, are you referring to like the fractional reserve system?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yes. That would be the way that most people refer to it.
But do people even know any better? I mean, because of this control over the people, the government keeps gaining more control by having, for example, the public education system, which the objective of that is obviously to make mindless slaves. I mean, they'd want us to be able to do little tasks, but they don't want us to actually think for ourselves. So I don't think it's as simple as saying, oh, the people don't want it, because, again, I don't think that the people know about other options necessarily.
Well, I mean, I would say it's not even that they don't know about other options. I think that something that can't be ignored is the fact that the U.S. dollar is legal tender in the United States. It must be accepted as a way of settling debts, public or private, and it must be used to pay taxes. And of course, if you don't pay your taxes, then you go to jail eventually for tax evasion. And so the people are compelled to use the dollar, and therefore it just has this kind of built-in network effect amongst everybody who doesn't want to go to jail, which is, you know, the vast majority of most people, if not everybody. People don't really have a choice, a real choice anyway, of whether or not to think in terms of dollars and to hold dollars. I mean, imagine a world where everybody decided that Bitcoin was the superior currency, but then April 14th rolls around and everybody's cashing out Bitcoins for dollars to pay their taxes. I mean, if that doesn't sound absurd, I don't know what is, but it's certainly not any way of running an efficient, functional economy. As long as the dollar has this legal tender status, I think that it's going to maintain hegemony, at least in the United States, and worldwide. You know, the dollar as a kind of a petrol currency or oil-backed currency, as it were. It has its own kind of macroeconomic implications as well.
I would add to this. This is a bit pedantic, but I would suggest that most transactions aren't necessarily done in U.S. dollars. Now, all amounts that are displayed, everything that we deal with, are displayed in U.S. dollars, and the unit of account that we know and love, and I think most of us do love it, which we can get into, is in U.S. dollars. But then you go to the point of sale terminal and you pay with your Visa card, or you pay with your MasterCard, or whatever it is. At that point, you get an IOU that's now been issued from you to Visa, and then from, again, there's actually a lot of intermediaries, but Visa to the store itself, and all of these funds settle over time, and so we have a unit of account that's very functional in the currency, and we have a store of value that's pretty good with our currency. It's not excellent, as a lot of libertarians like to say. It depreciates to 3% per year, but we have good store value options, which is what people typically do. But I think that the point that I would try to make is that there is a lot of subtlety to some of these decisions that we make, and it probably is worth noting that you should consider that the currency is made up of numerous parts, some of which we like a lot and some of which we don't, and many of which we choose not to engage in, such as holding U.S. dollars, which most of us would instead put money into our Roth IRAs or into real estate or something like this. So there are options at different levels of the equation, and it's not just so simple as U.S. dollars all the time, every day by everybody, and on and on. Feel free to correct me if you disagree.
Well, okay, let's change gears for a second. Do you guys think this may sound a little bit conspiratorial, but how much, like, do you think that the powers that be are actively trying to hijack Bitcoin and make it their own? And do you think that there is a sense of we're going to lose our stranglehold on the population? Like, how cognizant do you think that power structure is of its impending doom?
I'll let you go first, Chris.
It's a free market, so I don't really believe in conspiracies so much.
Wait, are you kidding me? You're going to tell me that we have a free market in the United States?
Yeah, I would.
And you think that, and incidentally, the dollar is a good store of value only because they manipulate the crap out of it and artificially prop it up in like 100 different ways.
I don't believe in market manipulation either. So I'm very much a fan of the Chicago School of Economics, and this was a huge moment in my life when I realized this, and I don't think a lot of people understand this, but I believe that deep markets are efficient. There's a lot of ramifications to that, and one of those ramifications are things that there's probably no such thing as market manipulation. Additionally, it makes conspiracies very difficult to pull off or even justify from like a natural science point of view. In that there's typically an incentive for people to find the optimal efficiency in any deep market, and that would preclude any chance of significant collusion. Now, I will say that the government typically perverts incentives, so that's a whole different discussion. But in general, I don't think that Bitcoin has that level of collusion or any real government regulation right now. And additionally, I would suggest that what will probably happen is the winners will keep on winning. That's typically what happens because they have investment capital to work with, and because they're talented. Oftentimes, that's my unpopular opinion. Maybe John wants to interject here.
So I think that the U.S. dollar market. I mean, it depends on how you define manipulation. I mean, gold and silver are both very deep markets. But I would consider those markets heavily manipulated, at least by governments and probably by other players as well. There was the story from the 80s of these two guys who tried to corner the silver market and basically just drove up the price. And then the government, being one of the largest governments, being some of the largest holders of gold, can easily suppress the gold price by just selling into the market. And there's been speculation that they've been manipulating the gold price and the silver price using their huge amounts of purchasing power which they only have because they can compel the market to give them money. And as to Tatiana's question about whether this is some sort of co-option and how this is going to play out and stuff. It goes back to what I said about the banks getting involved. I think that some people, some institutions are looking at blockchain technology and they're seeing the benefits that it has, and they're trying to take what they see as the best aspects of this technology and trying to figure out ways that they can incorporate it. The Federal Reserve, no less distinguished an institution, has put out white papers basically describing blockchain technology in so many words as kind of a solution to inefficiencies in the international settlements payment system. They've been working with Ripple Labs to not maybe working with them, but they have looked at technologies like what Ripple Labs is developing and looking at how that could be used to replace the international correspondent banking system, and even ACH, Fedwire, SWIFT, all of these different payment rails that are kind of inefficient and not really tied together. They're looking at a global shared public ledger, aka a blockchain, as a way of solving some of those inefficiencies. Is that a co-option of Bitcoin or the technology? I don't think so. I think it's no more a co-option of Bitcoin technology than you could say libertarians co-opted Bitcoin technology. It's just a use, and it's It's just like any tool. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. And it's kind of up to every individual to kind of make their own moral judgments about whether something that they see out in the world is good or bad. I kind of look at these moves as neutral. I don't put any sort of moral judgment on them. But what's important to me is that Bitcoin itself, the real actual Bitcoin network, continues to be decentralized and continues to be used as a force for good to get around some of these payment blockades that are used to censor free speech and free association between people, and can be used as a tool of economic empowerment for people who otherwise wouldn't have the technology, the tools, or the means to really fully realize their economic independence in the world.
Do we want to talk a little bit about BitLicense in New York and subsequently BitLicense in California and how that will affect people's ability to maintain that sovereignty?
Yeah, sure. John, you want to go first? You're really big on that.
Yeah, I'll touch on this a little bit. I don't have too much to say about New York, other than I don't think what they're doing should exist. But I can talk a little bit more about California because I'm a little bit more aware of the details here, and it affects me a little bit more personally. So early this February, there was a bill announced here in California called AB 1326, and this bill would, quote, prohibit any person in this state from engaging in the business of virtual currency, unquote, without either a license from the state or an exemption from the state. This license has a non-refundable mandatory $5,000 application fee, and if your application is rejected, then you have to go back to Go and start over again and pay the $5,000 again to reapply. And if your application is accepted, then you have to pay for the costs of complying with the license, including capital requirements, which are proportional to kind of how much business you do, capitalization requirements. You have to file AML, KYC reports, SARS, and you basically it's like becoming a bank or a money transmitter. But these regulations are specific to virtual currency businesses, and they basically apply to anybody doing business in virtual currency other than merchants who accept virtual currency as a form of payment for goods or services. Anybody else, local Bitcoins trader buying and selling Bitcoin, Bitcoin exchange who takes dollars or cryptocurrencies from people and allows them to exchange them on an online platform, all the way up to the Coinbases or Circles of the world, who are these huge kind of Bitcoin banks acting as custodians of people's Bitcoins, kind of like almost like a decentralized PayPal or something, or a federated PayPal. All of them would have to kind of comply with this new regulation if AB 1326 is passed. And so I run a meetup here in California, in San Francisco specifically, called Buttonwood SF, which is kind of like a Satoshi Square or like a local Bitcoins in a meetup form where people can come together once a week and trade digital currencies face-to-face in a group setting. Basically, if AB 1326 is passed, all of the people who go to that meetup will be criminals if they don't acquire and comply with these new regulations, acquire one of these licenses and comply with these regulations. And so this was deeply disturbing to me, and so I started a petition on change.org to have the assembly member who introduced this bill withdraw the bill, and further petitioning the assembly member and the rest of the California State Legislature to not introduce any similar bills in the future.
So here's the thing that's kind of interesting right now with Bitcoin regulation, and this is something I'm definitely not an expert on, but you have something that's probably very, very profitable for all the players involved. And you have this interesting sort of rift here between the east and the west coast of the United States, in that there's two major finance and economic centers, one in San Francisco and one in New York City. And so, an efficient system, you can expect that both of them will be competing with each other, at least in my view, not colluding. I think at first you'll probably see regulators huff and puff. I'm certain that the incumbents will try very hard to starve out people that come to John's meetups. I definitely believe that that would be a ramification, and that would certainly be unfortunate. But I do believe that the ultimate result is that regulatory encumbrances will diminish over time as these efficiencies come to bear. There are also cases where a city like Miami, who it does have a number of exchanges, by the way, that serve South America, could find themselves in a great position to produce services for the economy at the expense of business for New York and California. Now, again, I don't see that lasting for very long. If we start seeing major banks open up here, it's highly probable that that will change the legislation over there in New York. I would also say, too, that Bitcoiners are very, very creative. So I think that really, the on-ramps onto Bitcoin could be regulated to a degree that encumbers the small guy, but I think that ultimately the products and services that people come up with in Bitcoin will very quickly route around those highways thereafter. And while I can't say now necessarily that I have any slam dunk solution, I will be not even the least bit surprised if this becomes a non-issue with sites like Purse.io or something like that, where they come up with something really kind of creative to kind of just render the regulation redundant. But we shall see.
Chris, can you repeat the last part? You cut out.
I think that what will happen there, I don't know if I lost you, towards the end, I think the Bitcoiners are very bright people, and they come up with extremely creative solutions to a lot of problems that are essentially regulatory problems, and they route around the regulation. So I think that what will happen is that we will see a lot of creative solutions to these regulatory encumbrances. Certainly, Purse.io is one step in that direction, but it would not surprise me if there are others thereafter completely redundant and unable to be enforced.
The problem is that if Purse.io, if this kind of regulation passes, either AB 1326 in California or the bit license in New York, then Purse.io is going to have to comply with those regulations, which are basically the same kind of regulations that banks have to comply with, including things like identity checks for all their customers. The whole point of these in-person trades that happen at my meetup or Satoshi Square in New York, and face-to-face through local Bitcoin transactions all over the world, is that it provides a more private experience where you're not under constant surveillance, where you don't have to turn over your personal, sensitive personal information over to strangers on the internet, and where people who don't even have that kind of documentation, because they're undocumented or they don't want to be a part of that system, can still have access to this technology. And so if all of the on-ramps are regulated in the way that AB 1326 or the bit license or even the traditional money transmitter, money service businesses regulations want to regulate these kinds of activities, you're just excluding an entire class of people from Bitcoin and from this technology. And I don't think that's a good thing, and I don't think that it's really going to be possible to kind of circumvent these regulations without effectively criminalizing yourself, which opens you up to, thousands or millions of dollars in fines and many long years in prison. And I don't think somebody's going to take that risk for a Bitcoin. It's just not knowingly anyway. We already seen what would have happened to people who circumvent intentionally those regulations. I don't think that there are going to be too many people who want to follow in their footsteps.
I agree with that last part especially. I don't, it's unfortunate that it just seems like the United States has lost a lot of that small business mentality. I mean, I thought that it was supposed to be a country where the little guy could make his way, and it was even Steven. And especially with the economy being so destroyed at this time, I think that it would be great if people would be free to make a little bit of money, because if they can't wait it out, they're just going to move into something else. And I don't think that a lot of people have the luxury to risk getting in trouble, like John was saying, or wait it out, even though I do think that some of them will sort of, as Chris described.
Well, that's why I was mentioning earlier that I see most of the opportunity in like the developing parts of the world, where a lot of these kinds of regulations either don't exist or are just like not really enforceable because the government just doesn't have the resources to do it. And so I'm kind of like most hopeful for Bitcoin adoption and Bitcoin innovation in parts of the world that don't have these kind of oppressive financial regulations that cut out millions of potentially billions of people out of the market.
Two things. Number one, that great. Now I forgot what both of them were. No, I'm just kidding. I wasn't, but I remembered. So. Something that a friend of mine had mentioned to me about the bit license in California, she said, this guy is just trying to make a name for himself, and we shouldn't give him the attention. And I think that there's something to be said for that. Ben Losky made a really big name for himself with his work on bit license. So the California proposal may be nothing more than a way to gain attention by the I'm not sure what is the senator that has proposed it.
Well, it's not working because nobody knows that this thing even exists. I mean, like when I bring it up to people, it's usually the first time that they've ever heard of it. So he made it. If getting attention or making a name for himself was kind of his purpose for doing this, he's not really doing a good job.
No, but
if we want to just call him, he who shall not be named, who has introduced this California bit license, that's fine too. I would much prefer that this be a conversation about ideas and the bad ideas that are represented by this California bit license than make it a personal thing. Like this, like my opposition, my petition, it's not about me. It's not even about my meetup. It's about the freedom of transaction. It's about the right of people to transact with people in private. As long as they're not infringing on the rights of other people, that shouldn't be a problem. When you talk about how Bitcoin transactions are essentially just digital signatures, we start talking about the freedom of press, like the ability to just write things down. And it just so happens to be in a digital form. Like, these issues are very complicated and go far beyond like personalities and like ego and stuff. It's like these are really fundamental issues of freedom amongst human beings. Like we're all just people. We're all just human beings on this planet, and some people have given themselves, at least they think that they have, rights to tell other people what they can and can't do, even when those kind of actions and behaviors aren't affecting the rights of other people. And I think that's wrong. And in this case, I think that the person who shall not be named who's introduced this California bit license is very wrong.
I would just want to throw out there, it's the role of Congress typically and historically to protect business interests. Like that is their branch's description. And then you can take it into the judicial courts, and that's where like the role of like the non-businesses are typically represented. Typically. So when you look at these regulations, they're always written for the incumbents, and you can cry foul, and I'll agree with you, it is a foul. But like the role of a lot of these like internet companies these days is to work for the small guy. So you see this in Uber. You see this in Airbnb, and what they try to do more than not is render the law redundant and unenforceable. That is their business efficiency, is to find something that can't be enforced well and to leverage that and to render the law useless and in one way or another take it off the books. And I think that when we talk about some of these laws as it affects Bitcoin, there's this company, Abra. I don't actually know if they're going to succeed or not, but they're very much following in that vein. And again, like I'm a bit of an optimist here with Bitcoin, but a lot of these companies are typically very innovative in these respects. So I wouldn't be surprised if the law just sounds ridiculous, like you can't sell Bitcoin to somebody. It's probable that the laws of the universe will conspire, for lack of a better word, to ensure that the market sees an efficiency otherwise formed this that way. And I actually even like it when these laws are formed and they're rendered useless. I mean, we saw that even in the 90s with munitions-grade cryptography being an export restriction or something. So while I think it's very important that you're doing what you're doing, and I really like you bringing awareness to the issue, a lot of the reasons why it probably isn't noticed by many people is because it's a business case that Congress has to make, and then that gets taken at that point over to the people to care about thereafter. So it's important to keep that in mind at some level, if you see it that way, which some people do. I do.
Well, I mean, one thing, local Bitcoins already exist, and local Bitcoins is already facilitating peer-to-peer Bitcoin cryptocurrency transactions all over the world every day. But people are still getting set up in sting operations and arrested. I mean, I watched your video with this gentleman in Florida who had this exact same thing occur to him. He set up a peer-to-peer Bitcoin transaction using a local Bitcoins or similar kind of service, and it ended up being law enforcement, and they arrested him. And now he's facing thousands of dollars in fines and many years in jail. And that is the end game of Abra if they don't get compliant with these regulations. I think Abra is probably going to be more suitable for, again, these developing regions of the world where these kinds of strict regulations, licenses, KYC, and all that stuff is not so entrenched and or so stringently enforced. But here in the United States, apparently selling Bitcoin to somebody is a far more serious offense in the eyes of the government than renting out your spare room or giving somebody a ride. So it's just that Uber and Airbnb and these kind of companies were able to get away with it because the penalties weren't that serious. But when it comes to breaking financial laws and regulations, the consequences are the costs are just too high. I mean, it's just not worth it. So I don't think outright civil disobedience, if you will, is a really sustainable solution, at least in the short term.
So real quick on that, like you're absolutely right that it's a travesty, and Mitchell Espinoza is the person here who's facing a lot of problems. You can search for him online and you can see. What I was going to say, if Mitchell Espinoza was selling gold, there would not have been a problem. Like it just defies all common sense that Bitcoin couldn't be traded, in my mind. And for all of those reasons, I think that it's improbable to last very long as a ridiculous piece of legislation. And we shall see. I mean, I'm on your side here. I agree that it's complete and total nonsense. And I feel terrible for the people getting sucked into this crap. I think that I'm just more optimistic about the end result. And I see these people as like not as big in terms of civil liberties as like Rosa Parks or something, but like the way we know that there are bad laws are often by like making them and then seeing what happens. And then in these cases, you're finding like good young men who have a lot of economic prospects being taken out of like the wage earner pools and for nothing that's detrimental to society, in my mind.
Yeah.
Well, let's not forget that the Uber offices also, as a side note, were raided a few weeks ago, and they took everybody's computers. So it's not like, and they're fining them, and then they're going to have to tie them up in court. So they're basically bullying people, bullying new innovative companies, and using the strong arm of the law and the power of whatever backing they can muster in order to force people out. And that's not really supporting the free market idea, Chris.
like it or not, that's part of the free market. Like you have to fight.
You can't use the government to enforce whatever you want. That's not using the free market. That's just being a dick. Excuse my language, but I mean...
It's certainly that. It is absolutely that. And here's the thing. It's like, you see this even with, like, petty criminals. Like, petty criminals will use the law to get other competing petty criminals thrown in jail. Like, if I sell crack and there's another guy who's selling crack, like, either I'll shoot him or I'll call the cops on him. Whatever I can get away with. And it's not, like, right, but I would typically blame, like, the way the government's structured more so than the companies. Because once that jar is, like, opened, once that, like, Pandora's box is opened, now they have a responsibility economically to be the bully because that was the interface that was declared. And if they didn't, then Lyft would be the thinking. That's typically how I see it. I don't like it, and I think that the problems lie with the way the government runs, but it's not necessarily like Uber's fault. Like, they had to do it because that's where the economic efficiency was for them.
Wait, I didn't think that Uber was the bad guy in any of this scenario.
Okay, then that's fine. Then we're on.
No, I mean, I think that Uber's getting screwed by getting beaten up by the government because the taxi people are getting all mad because their lockdown on the system is being threatened.
Oh, so there's actually two sides to that. So I thought you were talking about the other side. Yes, the taxi companies are trying to screw Uber, and that's incumbent protectionism. But Uber is also running an offensive campaign on, like, Lyft, and they're, like, doing things like, John, maybe you know, but they're calling up, like, rides, and they're not actually, like, having people there, and there's a couple other things like that as well. Like, everybody's, it's a shit show. Everyone's trying to compete. That's how it ends up happening sometimes. It's business.
Where is the safest place for Bitcoin businesses in the world right now?
John, you want to take that one?
Not the U.S.
Probably like Panama.
No, I've heard good things about Switzerland, but it depends on what you're trying to do. I mean,
Isle
if you're,
of Man.
Apparently, the Isle of Man was a promising place, but they kind of backtracked on a lot of the things that they said that they were going to do or not do, as it were. So I don't know what the status is currently regarding their kind of safe haven status for Bitcoin companies. But I've heard good things about Switzerland. It just depends on what you want to do and who your market is. I mean, if your market is U.S. customers, you're hosed. I mean, you have to comply with these regulations. U.S. regulations are viral. Even if you're based in another country, if you have any U.S. customers, you have to comply with U.S. AML and KYC regulations, and there's a whole bunch of reporting requirements that go along with it, which can eat up your budget through compliance costs. So I think anywhere in the world that isn't the U.S. is probably better for Bitcoin businesses. And just don't serve U.S. customers. Just avoid U.S. jurisdiction like the plague, and your compliance costs will drop dramatically, I think.
Another way of looking at it too, though, is what is safe for a business is that which makes it money. So a safe place is a business that makes money in a location, and by that definition, I think all of the largest Bitcoin companies are in the United States. So you look at Coinbase, Circle, ItBit's pretty big now, BitPay. They're all in the United States. So safe in terms of staying in business and making payroll, probably United States. Safe in terms of running Silk Road, I don't even know, maybe North Korea. Lieberland, maybe, I don't know.
Speaking about the Silk Road,
I consider safe not under the threat of violence, and so that would probably be, not the U.S.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the businesses are here. This seems to be a hub of everything still. I was going to say about the Silk Road, over the weekend, I went and I saw the movie Deep Web, which is about Ross Ulbricht. The title is very misleading, but I thought it was excellent. And Bill and Ted got back together to make it, which is so cool.
Yes, it is.
I didn't know that
Keanu Reeves narrated it and Alex Winters directed it, right?
Yep, it was really, really good. I saw it in Montclair for the film festival, So I know that's like a little bit off topic, but it was really, really moving. I was devastated during the movie. I mean, it was so awful. And they have these kind of home videos of Ross where it really drives home that it's a human being. You know, I've been lucky enough to spend time with the family. I really enjoy their company. I think they're wonderful people. And I'm really hoping that that movie is going to raise awareness, because they moved the sentencing to the end of the month, to May 29th. I believe it's May 29th. But before that, on May 22nd in New York, some parents whose children allegedly died from purchasing drugs on the Silk Road, there's 6 of them, which it's very sad that their children passed away. That being said, they're trying to hold Ross accountable for it instead of maybe their own kids for doing drugs. And also, arguably, who's to say that they didn't get? I mean, there were studies showing that the drugs and Silk Road made the drug industry much safer and better for drug users. So,
you know, Tatiana, I think that the parents of victims of drunk driving should sue the dealerships. That's what I think, because clearly they're culpable here.
Yeah.
No, I think that's faulty logic, trying to go after Ross because their kids made poor decisions about their recreational drug use. You know, if their kids were probably going to acquire the drugs, whether it was through the Silk Road or on the streets, where would their parents have preferred that the kids acquire the drugs from? You know, somebody where there's like no quality control at all. There's no reviews as to the quality of the drugs, where the person could rob them in person or otherwise, you know, threaten them, where they could get arrested and a sting or a bust or something. You know, I mean, like what you just said, you know, there's a lot of evidence that the Silk Road, one way or another, made the drug market safer. They reduced opportunities for violence. They put in a system of quality control through their rating system. You know, sure, that could be gamed, but it seemed to work for most of the people who use the website. And they did this all in an environment where people could go to forums if they had any questions about safe usage, where they could, you know, ask these kinds of questions in a kind of judgment-free zone. And so, you know, I think that the Silk Road, rather than being something to be condemned, something that should be shut down, I think it was an experiment that should be looked at as a model for what a legal or decriminalized drug marketplace could look like in the future.
Yeah, you put that really well, John. I don't have much to add to that. Certainly, what wasn't brought to trial were all the survivors that, you know, supply will hit demand. So for people that were able to find safer drugs, like, they aren't dead, right? So you can't put those people in front of the jury. But yeah, the problem with the drug war is that, like, why are we doing it? Are we doing it to, like, reduce crime? Are we doing it to improve public health? Like, there's no actual motive anymore, or I don't even know if there was. So there's no way to really there's a way to really, like, hold Ross Ulbricht to any meaningful standard of I don't know, evaluation. He's just guilty by way of being there, and you know, I get it, but it's probably not the way to run an efficient government. So we'll see. I mean, the one thing I have to say, the one, like, silver lining and all of that, and it's a weird thing to say, but he's white, and I say that because the drug war is such a racially charged thing. I think that it hasn't been brought to America's attention as much because it was typically minorities that were affected. So at some level, like, if we have more, like, white people, like, I feel like, I hate to say, my grandmother is going to care more. Like, she's not a racist, but, like, that's her generation. Like, they only know that this was something that, like, immigrants dealt with or something like that. So
I agree with that.
See.
I agree with that point for sure, that that it has been typically something where the minorities just get fed into the prison system. So maybe it will be but I mean that's hard to say right now with looking at an individual. That's I mean Ross is in jail and he is like teaching yoga and physics and tutoring math. I mean this guy really, come on now. And the other thing that I found really stood out with the movie was something that I wasn't aware of because I don't go on the Silk Road or anything, but that they really had sort of a philosophy in that community. It wasn't just about, oh, let's all get high and do drugs now. It was about the freedom. And it was a FU to the system saying, we're not going to listen to your rules because we think they're stupid and they don't really apply to us. So, and there's validity in what they were saying other than the government used its strong arm to suppress it. So I thought that was a really cool part about it that I didn't really realize. I'm actually going to be having Lynn on June 1st, I believe it is. So right after the sentencing happens, and she said that it takes about a year for the appeal. So if people want to be tuning in, supporting, May 22nd, she'd love to have some people at the courthouse in New York. On May 29th during the sentencing, I'm going to be unable to attend, but if anybody can go, please go, and also spread the word about this. If you can donate $1, whatever, anything, because even if that money isn't that much necessarily, at least it shows support in terms of yet another voice crying out that we're not going to be oppressed anymore, and these are our bodies and we'll do whatever we want with them. So on that unhappy note, I think we should wrap up the show. I think that we could definitely do another one of these really soon. I really appreciated both of your voices. You're both really incredible. Can you tell people where they can find the latest information about you, maybe your Twitter and your website and stuff like that?
Sure. So you can reach me at any time on chrisderose.com, and there's links to all the stuff I do. I really love talking to both of you. I've had a couple of long conversations with John, and he is one of my favorite people to talk to for that reason in this space. So certainly Tatiana, we've had long conversations as well, but not as we've had more I think than John has. So I don't know. John and I are both programmers, and we're able to connect at the programming level. So, anyways, John, over to you.
Actually, not a programmer. I only
you
speak.
Have to be a programmer.
I only speak human, no computer. But flattered that you would say so. David Schwartz from Ripple Labs said, "I know enough to be dangerous." So you can follow me on Twitter at Litecoin, LIGHTCOIN, and you can find out all about the various projects I'm working on through my website, LIGHTCO.in. That's liteco.in.
Awesome. All right. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you very much to Liberty.me for having us. Hello to the LTB audience. Hope you can join us over at Liberty.me. There's all sorts of cool conversations happening here. I'll be back next week. I think next week I have Pamela Morgan, who's one of my favorite ladies and lawyers. She's always giving me great advice. She's doing really good work on smart contracts. So if people are interested in finding out more about smart contracts from somebody who will explain it to you like you're a human and not a robot, I got the gal for you. I could be reached at TatianaMoroz.com or CryptoMediaHub.com. Thanks again, everybody, and good night. Peace out.
I do consulting and advising for digital currency startups.
Very cool. So I brought us all together today because I had some interesting conversations with John that I followed up with Chris. But before we get to that, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about a totally personal, self-serving question that I've just randomly been wondering about. What's going on with Counterparty? What are they working on right now, Chris?
A lot of stuff. I'm not privy to discuss everything, but Symbiont certainly is chugging ahead. I think they've got some pretty big announcements. Symbiont is, I guess, the phoenix that rose from the ashes of the Overstock deal, the Medici deal. The principals that were involved in Medici had left the Medici project and started Symbiont. So Symbiont has a subset of the features that were in the Medici project and some additional features that weren't. So I think a lot of people in the community were very discouraged when the overstock thing kind of unraveled. But certainly for me, I've seen a lot of work being done with Symbiont, and I personally expect that a lot of the perceived losses will be quickly gained as they see that project gain momentum. But it's still a little too soon to tell. There's a lot of work that they're doing in their end. In the community, we've got all kinds of stuff. We have our first mobile wallet was pretty exciting. We have a integrated Chrome wallet, which is also very exciting. And there's a game that is going to be I think the first cryptocurrency 2.0 game that's launching on the Counterparty network, and that's really cool too. That's something we could probably talk about at length, but I'll keep that answer as is.
Okay, well, wait, what's the Symbiont project? Because I don't really understand what that is completely, and some people at home may not know what that is.
Right, well, that's kind of by design at the moment, unfortunately. It is, what I can tell you, and really the extent of even what I know, is that it is a project to facilitate more traditional integrations with Wall Street, to facilitate security and, I believe, bond transfers, and to facilitate better settlement of these types of assets using Bitcoin and using Counterparty.
Okay.
It's a little bit similar to what perhaps you heard today with NASDAQ. So they're doing something very similar, and I think this is a new wave of applications that we'll see in the next year. All the big players are doing.
Okay, so is that a good thing? I don't know. I mean, is that something that's going to, I guess maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit, but if we're going to be talking about the soul of Bitcoin, when I think of Bitcoin, I think of it as the great liberator for the people. And the concept of decentralized apps and just that type of thing is really something that I think mankind has been searching for unsuccessfully until now, since the beginning of time. So is that going to be something geared toward the banking industry? Who would be benefiting from that type of technology?
Yeah, so I mean that definitely gets into the heart of I think the episode that we're going for. I personally don't have a problem with the banks, but I know the libertarian platform does. So at some level, we have to decide, is Bitcoin a social movement? Is it technology? Is it a tool? Is it all of the above? In terms of what it's good for, is it good for a subset of these things? It's a technology, and it can be used for good purposes and bad. I like a lot of the services that Wall Street does. That must be a minority of the Bitcoin movement, but for me, I find that there's a lot of value in those services, which we can get into at length if you like, but that may not be the answer you want to hear. I don't know.
I don't think that don't feel any pressure from me to answer in any way. This is the point of a discussion. John, did you want to comment on that in any way?
So I think that these moves by the traditional financial services companies to get involved with Bitcoin is predictable. I mean, it's a new technology that's getting a lot of attention, and it also happens to add a lot of efficiency to some of their operations. So it's not surprising that they're looking at blockchain technology. Some of them are looking at building directly on the Bitcoin protocol. And I think the news about NASDAQ was not about them putting a production system on the Bitcoin protocol, but rather they're just using the colored coins protocol on top of Bitcoin open assets for a trial run to see how their assets interact with blockchain technology. And it remains to be seen whether they're actually going to continue using the Bitcoin blockchain or whether they're going to try to roll their own blockchain and use a kind of centrally administered kind of blockchain, like what some of the other experiments, like the Isle of Man, the recent Isle of Man blockchain integration was discussing. They were talking about using a centrally administered blockchain kind of system. And so, are these things positive, negative? I mean, it's kind of a continuation of the status quo, just powered by blockchain. Um, does it provide benefits to all of the people using those kinds of systems? Well, I mean, we hope. I mean, that's why they're trying it out. They're seeing if it reduces costs, increases efficiencies, and ultimately ends up being a better system for everybody who's using those systems. Now, does it change the fundamental nature of those systems? Not really. And so if you're not really a fan of the fundamental nature of those systems, then this news probably doesn't really mean much to you.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I don't think that there's a problem with banking services separate from, for example, the Federal Reserve. I mean, I like having a bank, I guess. I don't even know if I do. I don't know if that's a true statement. But arguably, a bank does fulfill some sort of purpose. I think that the issue that people have is more the central banking system and banks ripping people off constantly. I do think that there's obviously costs associated with sending money from place to place, or if there's some sort of, if you're like a small person and you only have a couple $100s in the bank isn't making money off of you. So when you overdraft your account, hello, everybody. This is Tatiana Moroz, and welcome to the Tatiana Moroz Show. I'm here with my friends Chris DeRose and John Light. They're both into Bitcoin, and we're very happy to be here on Liberty.me. We're going to be broadcasting this podcast version of this onto LTV2, so welcome to that audience. Very happy to be here. Chris, John, a pleasure. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine.
Thank you for having
us.
So why don't you guys tell everybody at home a little bit about what your, I guess, participation is in the space. Where do you fit?
John, do I go first?
Oh, I'll let you go first.
All right, so I've done a lot in this space. For those who haven't seen me, I've done writing for, many of the magazines, many of the online magazines and journals. Most recently, I've been writing for American Banker. And prior to that, I was contributing a little bit to Let's Talk Bitcoin. And what my real gig is in this space is in the Counterparty project. I'm the community director. So for those that don't know, Counterparty is a project that works atop of Bitcoin and provides a lot of 2.0 services, things like smart contracts and assets. And that's most of what I do. All right, John, your turn.
And black hats with white words. That's another thing you do.
Yes, it is. It most certainly is.
So I also do a little bit of work with Let's Talk Bitcoin Network. I have a podcast called P2P Connects Us, which is syndicated on Let's Talk Bitcoin Network, and it's also released through my website and blog, p2pconnects.us. It's all about peer-to-peer philosophy, technology, and culture, and how I think that's changing the world for the better, and also covering some of the current events that are happening, like government intervention in these new peer-to-peer markets, some of the technological advances, some of the social and cultural disruption that's happening as a result of the adoption of these kinds of technologies. And so it's just really fascinating to watch that. And in my professional life, that's something the podcast is something I do kind of as a hobby. In my professional life,
as much as one may dislike that, there is at least some sort of sense in terms of, okay, the bank needs to make money. I think the problem is that the bank is making money off of the little guy in a way that is very painful to a person that doesn't have a lot of money. Because if you're poor and you overdraft your bank account, then that $35 or whatever can be turning into, $150 very quickly, and things get out of control. As a random side note, what I find really frustrating with banking, no matter what bank that I use, is whenever it's in their favor to charge me immediately on my card, they're happy to do it. When it's a matter of me putting money in or needing an extra day or something like that, I'll notice that sometimes transactions don't hit for a few days, even though other ones do, and then all of a sudden, without knowing it, I can be overdrawn. And I think that that's really frustrating, because it's like, an email goes by instantly. Certain transactions happen instantly, but the ones that are important, like the ones that are going to cause you to overdraft, that's something that doesn't happen instantly. And then on top of that, which I guess the bankers would probably think that this is okay, but you know, when you call the bank and you explain it to them, they generally don't care, and they say, tough luck, you have to pay it, and that's the general attitude. So I think that breeds a lot of animosity with people. Nice cat.
Oh. Yeah.
You're muted, Chris. John, while Chris tries to figure that out, do you have anything that you wanted? Oh, here's Chris. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was trying to fix that echo issue we had earlier. Yeah, so, I mean, I would add to some of your complaints that would suggest are a little misplaced. I understand why people don't like banks, but it seems to me like more often than not the banks are spokesperson or the intermediaries between government rulings and government regulations and people. Like, banks don't necessarily want to make you their enemy. If you